Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. Today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about things that you need to think about when it comes to weak point training. And when I say weak point training, I mean that as a general term. As a general term, because your weak points could be from a performance perspective, they could be from an injury balance perspective, right? Because muscle imbalances create injuries. Or they could be from an aesthetic perspective if that's whatever goal it is you're chasing. But at the end of the day, the majority of us are seeking some sort of balanced musculature because if something is imbalanced, that's oftentimes one reason people look less aesthetic, if that's what you're chasing. But imbalances are also indicative of situations that can create performance problems and injuries, right? And what you need to remember is that the classic aesthetics thing actually was just based around balanced musculature of athletes to begin with. But you also need to remember there's a genetic and a body fat component to that. So just because someone doesn't look necessarily like a fitness model doesn't mean that they're not balanced in terms of musculature. So that's also something to factor in. You need to have an honest assessment of that when you're looking at it. All right, but here's the thing. Here's the thing. We all have weak points. All of us who have finished the novice phase have weak points. What I also want to reiterate before we get into this, novices don't have weak points. I've said this for many, many years, and I'm not even the first person to say this. A novice doesn't have weak points because their entire body is weak. In other words, if you're not strong on all your basic movements, your body is weak. You don't have weak points. Your weak point is your musculature in general. Right? Your weak point is your musculature in general. So you guys see me performing a couple of things for weak point training here. I mean, and it's pretty obvious your weak point training when you're down to doing small movements. You're doing movements that are getting pretty close to being single joint exercises. That's definitely weak point training. And in this case, it's one arm side laterals with a kettlebell. And then you guys see me doing skull crushers, tricep extensions with an Olympic barbell done with some extension of the shoulder. So what are we hitting with these things? Hitting side delts, and we're hitting triceps with a little bit of an extra focus on the long head, because those are obviously weak points for me. They're weak points both from a performance perspective and weak points from a physique perspective, even though I am not a physique competitor, a physique artist. It's not my thing. I am on YouTube every day, and there comes a threshold to where, as a fitness YouTuber, I probably need to have a better physique, even if it's not something I would ever care about outside of that, because I really wouldn't, and I don't. But it's even something I'm willing to admit I need to address further for my own income and outreach, right? So that is a weak point, isn't it? Those are weak points specific to my personal needs, not even necessarily my passions or what I care about. But the triceps, absolutely a weak point in terms of my performance. So here's the problem we run into. A lot of people, they'll have these weak points and they just start throwing random stuff at it. And in some cases, that fixes the problem. But in other cases, it doesn't. And here's what I mean. Your weak points have to be programmed around. All right, you're going to have to allocate training resources. You're going to have to advocate recovery towards it. And here's the thing. There might be a situation to where, let's say if your biceps are a lagging muscle, but you have a lot of recovery left because you're not really training near your maximum recoverable volume, it makes sense in that case to just do more chin-ups, right? It makes sense to do more chin-ups. But what happens if you're doing a lot of deadlifting? What happens if you're doing a lot of deadlifting? Then what do you do? Well, maybe you're doing a lot of deadlifting and your recovery is compromised and your back is limited. Well, in that case, it does make sense to do some curls. It does make sense to do some curls. But then you would have to ask the question of what would be the best form of curls to do. Should you just do a bunch of random curls? Should you do 4 different sorts of curls? Of course not. That's the sort of silly bodybuilder nonsense that people do to where they throw everything but the kitchen sink at the muscle. Bicep's not a complicated muscle. It doesn't have 4 different angles you can hit. It doesn't. It just doesn't. They don't exist. You know, in that case, you might say, well, I'm going to do some standing cheek curls. Why? Well, because they're a good core exercise. They work the spinal records. They work the abs. There's good EMG data on that. And if you do them with some movement of the shoulder joint, they work 2 of the functions of the bicep. Because the bicep doesn't just bend the elbow. It also extends the shoulder. Or, sorry, you get shoulder flexion. So you might do that. But what if a person says, hey, I'm also a mixed grip deadlifter. I'm worried about having strong biceps at the bottom. Well, you might opt for incline curls in that case, right? You might opt for incline curls in that case. So right there, we've looked at a situation to where you're going to look at the overall balance of the rest of your training, and you're going to look at the specifics of your weak point in picking an exercise. And that's what I mean. Put some thought into it. And I'm not saying there's a right or a wrong way to go about this, but put some thought into it. Now, some people might say, well, why would someone pick the incline curl? Because the incline curl puts a stretch on the bicep. There's a stretch reflex. That is arguable. Some people feel that might reduce the chance of tearing a bicep if you're a mixed grip deadlifter. Right, that's valuable. But the chin up will probably build just as much, if not more, bicep than those other two, but it also takes up more recovery resources. So that's going to depend upon the context of the rest of your training. So at that point, you're standing here going, do you go with a bigger movement or do you go with a smaller movement? Well, it's going to be context dependent. It's going to depend upon what you have in terms of recovery resources in your training. If you're just too dang tired from your other training to add 5 or 6 more sets of heavy weighted pull-ups every week from a dead hang, you're not going to be able to do that. And your biceps are going to continue to lag because you're not going to have the effort left to put into that exercise and to recover from it. In which case you need a smaller movement in that case. So then you have to pick between the cheek curl and something like the incline curl, saying, hey, what's going to be the best one of these for my situation? And here's what I would say. When you have a weak point, you need to attack that weak point hard. You need to hit it with a lot of volume. So that means you need to do a lot of sets, but it doesn't mean you need to do a lot of exercises for it. With any given muscle, we usually have just one element of that muscle that is the problem. And if you focus on that one element and you don't waste efforts on the other aspects of it, you're more likely to get through that weak point. So let's take the triceps, for example. I do a lot of pressing. I do a lot of floor pressing, do a lot of bench pressing, do a lot of overhead pressing. I do a lot of them. So my triceps are still lagging, but arguably, because I need the overhead press to go up more and it's more limited by the long head than the bench, and maybe my long head is lagging, I think that it is looking at it. Now, my tricep in general needs to be bigger and thicker relative to everything else, but my long head in particular right now, I think is a weak link. So you pick an exercise, in this case, that works that aspect of it, right? Because I both know that from an aesthetics perspective, I hate to have to say that because I hate saying that, but that's the reality of it. I need bigger, thicker triceps, and the long head contributes the most meat. It'll make my arm bigger. It'll look bigger. It'll measure bigger. And it also will carry over the most to my standing press because the long head does contribute there. So in my case, I'm looking at that saying that's where I need to go. So why would I waste a bunch of effort on exercises that focus on the lateral and medial head? Of course I wouldn't. I would look at that and say, where does my effort need to be? And if that's where the effort needs to be, that's what I'm going to do. So what's that accounting for? That's like 9 or 10 sets of this exercise I'm doing every week. I'm doing like 9 or 10 extra sets of this tricep extension every week in addition to my 2 serious pressing days, right? Because I have a max effort pressing day and then I have a dynamic effort pressing day. But my triceps just need a little more work. So I'm throwing in 9 or 10 sets every week of that specific movement. Go ahead and beat it up. I mean, in other words, if you have a weak point that you need to address with a specific exercise, you might as well program 8 to 10 sets of that exercise in every week. And you might need to split them up over multiple days. You know, that's totally reasonable for a weak point. And not just a bunch of random stuff. Don't just say, I'm going to do 4 different sorts of tricep extensions. No, you need to identify which one's going to give you the most bang for your buck. Also, you're going to need to look at these exercises and say, hey, which one of these exercises is going to let me add this extra volume without a recovery issue, without a connective tissue issue? If you have an exercise that you know is historically causing you tendinitis, a little smaller weak point movement, you can't really get away with doing a lot of volume of it. It's not going to be a good fit. And if you're doing a bunch of random stuff and you start getting tendinitis, you're not going to know which one to pull out. Be specific with it. And if it's not working, you're not getting the desired effect from the one that you want after a noticeable period of time, or it's causing connective tissue problems or irritation or inflammation, You're going to need to change it for something else. Don't be afraid to do so. Don't do something random. Rethink what you're doing and identify the problem and pick something else. Don't be afraid to change your weak point training when it's not giving you the desired results either. But don't do something randomly. Put some thought into it. Right? There needs to be thought into everything that we select to do in the gym. There needs to be thought behind it. We need to have a good reason to do it. Doesn't mean you can't add more. Doesn't mean we can't do a lot. But just all I'm saying is put some thought into it before you do it so that you make a good choice, not just a choice. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.